Welcome to the first Toff Talks. They're going to be a series of free conversations presented by the Toff in Town in collaboration with the City of Melbourne's Melbourne Conversations and Late Night Programming Initiative. And they're going to be held every Monday evening. And the idea is pretty simple. A couple of interesting people, here's some we prepared earlier, we'll be talking about interesting stuff in a bar, the Toff in fact. And you can interject digitally on Twitter via the hashtag Toff Talks. Or keep updated by following at melbconvo. My name's Ben Birchall. I'm one of the breakfasters on 3RRR, and I'll be your host for this evening. I think that's what you call me. Let's get started. We're going to be talking about music, copywriting tonight, sampling and remixing. And I guess, it's been around kind of forever. I'm really quite notably since the 70s with the advent of hip-hop. But it seems like it's never far from industry news, regardless of how old it is. And it's not always for the right reasons, but thankfully Wally DeBacca, also known as Gautier, has kind of handily put it back in the news in the past few weeks with his worldwide smash. It's kind of nice to say that about an Australian act. Somebody that I used to know, which features a sample of Louis Bonfa. But as much as it's talked about, how much do we really know about sampling and what's legal and what's not? What are the laws? How can you work within them? Do we always have to? How can we build a time machine and make Rick James stop MC Hammer from sampling Super Freak? You can't touch this. And at a time when creativity and technology seem to be moving faster than the law, how do artists navigate their way through this legal minefield? These questions and more will be nimbly handled by our panel this evening. First up, we've got Kirsty Rivers, who's the National Manager of Writer Services at APRA and AMCOS. Kirsty manages the membership departments in APRA's 5 state offices and services the needs of over 70,000 songwriting and publisher members around Australia, as well as the APRA Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island music grants programs. She's also the Vice Chair of Music Victoria and The Push, and she'll be off to the Music Victoria Bash after this. We've also got Julian Hewitt, a media arts lawyer. Julian is a lawyer who's been signed as an artist to major and independent labels and has an extensive background in touring and publishing, also recording and remixing bands, as well as lecturing on copyright and intellectual property law. Currently he represents acts like Chet Faker, Husky, Spuckadia and World's End Press, and also labels, festivals, film projects and creative businesses. Now, Phil, I'm going to read your bio because I couldn't write anything better than this. DJ Phil Ransom. Some call him a legend, others a survivor. His label, M Division, consider him a charity case. Since taking the geriatric Phil Ransom on board, they've managed to lose money on any project in which he is involved. With his past glories, are you okay with me reading this? It feels mean. The one-time Australian hip-hop pioneer and DJ extraordinaire has been reduced to playing K-pop to jocks, tourists and AM listeners. Nonetheless, they still hold out some hope that somewhere behind the weathered brow and receding hairline lays a fleeting last chance at musical redemption. Phil Ransom. I just want to start off by taking a very quick straw poll. Who makes music in this room? Hands up. And who knows the laws involved with sampling and remixing? Okay, well, it looks like we better get started then. We might start off by getting Julian to provide a little bit of context and define our terms for tonight. What are we talking about when we talk about copyright and mechanical royalties, the types of licenses, etc.? Julian, can you give us a bit of background on that?
Yeah, sure. I guess keeping it as simple as we can, there's 2 key copyrights in music that invariably, if you're a recording artist or a songwriter, you're going to be involved with at some level, and that's the copyright in a recording and the copyright in a song or a composition. Sometimes people find that hard to get their head around, but a simple way of explaining it would be, if you're talking about the song Let It Be, it's a song written by Lennon and McCartney, and we can all sit here today and sit at a keyboard or play with a guitar and have a notepad in front of us and write a song, and that's a copyright in itself, as in it's the melody of the song and it's the lyrics of the song. We can also make a recording of the song, so we can set up microphones and the 4 of us could do a recording of Let It Be, and that's going to be its own copyright. It'll be the thing that's been captured by the microphones onto tape or onto Pro Tools or onto whatever. That is going to be a copyright that exists separately to the copyright in the top line melody in the song, which is owned by Lennon and McCartney. So I guess every time that you're hearing music, unless it's in a live context, in which case you're not involved in the recording, you're just hearing the song. In all other contexts, you're hearing a recording and a song. So you can't have a recording without a song. So every time you're putting on a CD or playing an MP3 or listening to music in a recorded format, there's someone who's made a recording of that song and there's the song itself. So I guess when you're talking about sampling, it can only involve a sample that relates to the song. So you can have a sample that doesn't use a pre-existing recording, or if it samples a recording, it's always going to sample a part of the song at the same time. And one of the things that copyright exists, it's a legislative regime that gives property-like rights to creative things. So the idea that when it first came in, it was trying to balance the tension in society between encouraging freedom of expression, so encouraging people to be able to create works and to be able to do creative things that, you know, tell human stories or benefit society, with a need, I guess, to incentivise people to invest in creating works. So in a musician's context, without copyright, you can spend 10 years of your life making beautiful records and writing amazing songs, and without the existence of copyright, which is the proprietary thing around your creative process, you can't live off it. So really, without it there's no incentive commercially to do it. So you might still do it as a hobby because you love it, but there's no incentive for someone to invest in it. So it's trying to balance that tension. And in Australia, copyright lasts in terms of recordings for 50 years from the date the recording's made. So if this is being recorded today, there may well be a copyright in this recording of this panel, and it will last for 70 years. Did I say 54? 70 years from the date of creation. For compositions, so if we write a song, the copyright lasts for 70 years from the date of the death of the composers. And if it's multiple composers, from the date of the death of the last composer. So it goes for quite a long time. And originally, not that long ago, copyright only lasted 50 years. And I think with a lot of the baby boomers realised a lot of very, very valuable copyright works, and everyone talks about Sonny Bono and about Walt Disney, were due to come out of copyright, and they lobbied the American government passed the laws first. And
are those goalposts just going to move every 10 years or so as more and more works come out of copyright?
I guess maybe, because obviously, because it's a property-like right, you can deal with your copyright. If I write a song and record a song in my bedroom, I can treat that right like I can property. So I can rent it to someone, as in I can let someone use it for a specific period of time. I can sell it to someone for the life of copyright. So it definitely has a lot of value, and when you're dealing with, you know, multi-billion-dollar copyrights like you are sometimes, like, you know, a Beatles catalogue or a Michael Jackson catalogue or something, there's a lot at stake. So people will fight tooth and nail to protect that. But that's kind of I guess that's the underpinning of the music industry, is copyright, because without copyright, and when people talk about piracy decimating the recording industry, it's because the copyright's not being enforced. So there is a copyright in the recording that copyrights give you exclusive rights to certain things. So one of it is to make a copy. So one thing I can't do under the terms of the Copyright Act is burn a copy of a CD to sell to a friend. So that's something I can't do. I can't make an adaptation. I can't alter a master copyright. So I can't chop up a recording that I don't own and turn it into something else. And it's the same with the song. So I can't alter the lyrics of a song and then claim that I've got a share of this new copyright. Only the copyright owner can do that. So I could go, if one of Ben's songs I wanted to amend or change, he's the exclusive owner of that copyright unless he's assigned the rights to someone else. I have to go to Ben and say, you own these rights, I want to...
You can have them.
I want to create this new right.
Sorry, I get nervous around lawyers.
Yeah. So I guess when it comes to sampling and remixing, what you usually find is if there's a few different potential copyright infringements that are going on. One is usually that you're taking someone's top-line melody. So a really obvious example of, you know, a prominent sample would be Kanye West sampling Daft Punk. So in that case, Kanye West is taking their recording, because he's actually recording their recorded version of Fitter, Better, Faster. Yeah. And then that recording also obviously has the composition that they've written embedded in it. So there's two sets of copyrights that he's making use of. And the only reason he's able to do that legitimately and not be sued for it and not spend half his life in court is that he's gone up to them and said, or to their publishers and their record company and said, I want to do this. Can I do this? What commercial terms can we agree that will allow you to let me do it?
Well, that leads us quite well into the first example I guess we want to talk about tonight, which is the Gautier track, Somebody That I Used to Know. Phil, you've actually got that song here, and the song that it samples as well.
Sure. Just for comparison, I'll play a few bars of each. So this is the Gautier.
Sorry, I've never heard this. Who is this?
And this is the Louis Bonfa. Banfa? I always get it mixed up. So there's really not that much difference. It's basically the first two beats worth. And so there's barely any difference.
But he has been able to use that sample because he approached the copyright holder before the song was released, and now that it's gone huge, there's not any issues. Is that all?
It was actually, it was, he approached them after the song was
Really?
released. Yeah.
Okay.
Which, it puts you in a much worse position as a creative, because if you go to someone before the event and say, I want to use this, can I, let's agree terms, you, I guess, have the option of, if you can't agree something appropriate, not doing it. We were talking about Hilltop Woods before, but lots of clients that I rep, or that are firm reps, you know, use samples as part of their music. And if you're the copyright owner, if you're Louis Bonfa, or if you're Serron, the French disco guy, or whoever, you are well within your rights to say, I'm not granting you a license, you can't do it. And if they then go ahead and use the license under the Copyright Act, you can make them take all the CDs off the shelves, you can sue them for damages, you can make their life a living hell. So usually if you have any idea that something is going to be commercially successful, you would clear the sample in advance, because to not do it means that A, you may never be able to exploit that song that could make your career, and you are really, I guess, over a barrel in terms of trying to negotiate terms with someone, because it is a negotiation. So, yeah, it's generally very, very preferable to do it in advance.
There's not much of that song. It's 2 notes, really. It's two chords, and the version that Gautier uses isn't even the actual recording, is it? He's played it, but just emulated the style of that Louis Bonfa track. Phil, you sample music a lot, and you remix music a lot. Would you have cleared that sample?
Nope. I would have just replayed it. It's a standard, or reasonably standard, kind of Brazilian guitar piece, and there's probably hundreds or thousands of comparable things. It's like saying if you play the 3-bar blues that you could find some, historical precedent, and you would need to clear that. But that's me. I don't clear. So
I guess that brings us into that grey area of how much you can get away with, and it seems to be that when there's a lot of sales and a lot of money involved, that's when these things start to get complicated. Kirsty, you deal with that kind of stuff all the time, and we were saying before the talk that there is a lot of money flowing. It doesn't seem like it a lot of the time in the music industry. Money doesn't often get talked about, but these royalties do generate quite a bit of scratch.
Yeah, I guess that brings APRA into the equation, because we look after part of copyright, which is the public performing right, and we look after the musical work side, so the song side, that was what we're talking about. And the members of APRA are the music publishers and also the people who create the music in the first place. So Louis Bonfa would be represented by what we are, which is a collecting society in Brazil, and a music publisher. Gautier is a member of APRA, but he's also represented by a publisher here as well. Those people are going to be looking to make sure that their copyright, which is intellectual property, which is something that they rent or they choose to look after and protect, is creating an income stream for them. And APRA is a really primary income stream for a lot of those people. To give you some context for the sort of income that we are talking about, because it is really hard to make money in music, but at the moment APRA itself is earning about $240 million a year. So that's a substantial amount of money. And in the case of someone who's got a number one hit both here and overseas, the income that's going to come through is, you know, a lot of money. When there's a lot of money involved, people are going to make sure that their rights are being represented. Louis Bonfa has a publisher. They're going to make sure that in this case, where there's serious money being generated, that their rights are being represented, even though actually I think Louis Bonfa's dead and has been dead for some time, because the copyright still exists in that work. In this territory and every other territory, his publisher's going to make sure that if someone is using it and that song is getting significant airplay around the world, they're going to be red hot onto the fact that they have rights that should be exploited there, and they're going to make sure that they get a share of that income. And they would have to put in a claim. The publishers would put in a claim and say, that's our track, or we have a share in that track. And that's, while APRA would not negotiate how much of a share, we'd leave it to the lawyers to duke it out, as it were. The reason it's important is both the choice of the original creator to have a publisher, but also to create an income stream for their family, is such that the publisher is going to be making sure, if it's after the fact that they will put in a big claim. We could probably talk more about that particular case, but what we're really talking about is the creators, the people who actually own the music in the first place, wanting to make sure that their income stream is protected. And it's bloody hard to get an income stream these days.
I guess that's a big worldwide kind of hit. We're talking about lots of money, and that's when I guess the legal system will come into play. I'm guessing a lot of the people in this room, and I know myself, you're dealing with small kind of numbers, not many sales, if any. How does it work for somebody who's just making music in the bedroom? How much music are you allowed to steal, you know, before it becomes a problem?
I guess the difficult thing with copyright is it's an intersection of law, which is trying to be definitive and absolute, with creativity, which is the opposite of that. I guess in terms of recordings, it's easier because a recording has a more definable form, and people can conduct tests on things and do sonic evaluations and work out if that's the same recording. But when it comes to a composition, a song that you might write in a bedroom, and you might hear two different songs and say, if anyone was looking online the last day or two, the Delta Goodrem Arcade Fire comparison, that Delta Goodrem's current single is very, very similar in terms of its top-line melody to an Arcade Fire song. There's no suggestion that she's sampled the recording of Arcade Fire. She's created a whole new song, but it sounds very, very similar to the Arcade Fire song, and it has the same melodic movements. And it's not a really easy question to answer, because the value in a composition, it's not in the arrangement of the composition. You can do a bossa nova version of a song, or a hard rock version of a song, or a disco version of a song. It's in the top line melody and the lyrics. So for most songs, that's going to be the vocal melody, but not always. Like obviously the Men at Work case, they talked about the flute sample being a part of the top line melody, but it's really the very key element of the song that the song doesn't exist without. And bands all the time will have massive fights within themselves about whether...
Every day.
Yeah, every day. About whether one member of the band is contributed to the top line melody or not. And we were talking about it before we came on, but all the time people have disputes, and they say, well, there's 4 of us in the band, we all wrote the song. That's 25% each. Whereas the lead singer might say, well, hold on, I worked out the chords and the melody and the lyrics, and yes, your bass line's good, but the song exists without it. Like, I wrote the song, like, we're playing as a band, but the song existed. And I guess in the eyes of the law, probably the lead singer is closer to being accurate as to defining what a copyright is. But it's a very ambiguous discussion. Like, there's a really great Jonathan Lethem essay on talking about appropriation, talking about how people come up with ideas and how they create works. Because the idea under the Copyright Act is that every creative thing that has copyright is new and unique. And of course, how can it be? Like, it never is. There's only a limited scale of music. There's only a certain number of chords. It never happens. But he talks about, he's got this, it's pretty short, so I'll quickly read it. In 1941, on his front porch, Muddy Waters recorded a song for Alan Lomax, who's a famous folklorist. After singing the song, which Muddy Waters told Lomax was entitled Country Blues, Waters described how he came to write it. He said, I made it on about the 8th of October, 1938. I was fixing a puncture on a car. I'd been mistreated by a girl, I felt blue, and the song fell into my mind, and it came to me just like that, and I started singing. So Lomax, who knew of Robert Johnson, and his recording called Walking Blues, which is really similar to country blues, he asked Muddy Waters, are there any other songs that use the same tune? So Muddy Waters goes, yeah, there's been blues played like that. But this song, it comes from the cotton field. And yeah, a boy once put a record out, Robert Johnson. He put it out, Walking Blues. I heard the tune before, I heard it on his record. And I learned it from Son House. So in nearly one breath, Waters offers 5 different accounts. He says he was the author of the work, he made it. I made it on a certain date. He says there's a passive explanation, it just came to me like that. So you often talk about people saying I channeled it from God, or I channeled it from, I was in a state and I achieved the song. And after Alan Lomax says to him, well, could you have heard it from somewhere else? Muddy Waters says, without any shame or misgiving or anything, he says, oh yeah, I did hear a version by Robert Johnson, but I was taught it by Son House. So, and then at the end of that he says, oh, the song came from the cotton fields. So like trying to identify who owns a song in a creative sense is a really difficult thing to do. And when you find that when there's copyright disputes about appropriation, it's usually brought not by artists, because most artists, occasionally it is, but I would say 95% of the time it's brought by the publishers or the record companies, or by people who've got a commercial interest but not a creative interest, who will look to enforce a copyright for commercial reasons, and usually when there's lots of money at stake, and not when it's a matter of pride or principle. And it's usually related to, it's usually not by the creative, because most creatives will acknowledge that the majority of the works they write have been influenced at some level by prior works.
I'm not going to entirely agree. The reason is, in the day-to-day life that I lead, which is talking to people who write songs all the time in bands, all around the country, constantly, that is probably where the cases begin. But our daily life is spent talking people through who owns the copyright, because of the emotional connection with the songs and creating the songs that happens when you're in a band. I'm talking about band, but don't put a genre to it, it could be anything. Because often people who are arranging something have a connection, because their musical value and their musicianship is part of how the song comes to be recorded or how the song is played live, doesn't necessarily relate to who wrote the song. And I guess we should put one other caveat on that as well, which is that difference between the words and the music, because most of the conversations that we have on a daily basis at APRA, dealing with people who write songs all the time and people who arrange songs but don't necessarily come with the original, melody and lyrics, are about being involved in the song, not actually the ownership of that music, the musical work, but actually the fact of being in a band and playing together. So most of the conversations we have are about disentangling those band relationships, about dealing with someone is going to own that song. And one of the number one things, the places where it starts, is the person who writes the lyrics, or the people who are involved in writing the lyrics, is actually covered under a different copyright to the musical work. So we can sort of start by disentangling that relationship there. So although the commercial aspect is it has a value and it is important, there is an emotional relationship with owning the song or being a songwriter as well. And I think I wouldn't want to play that down.
Yeah, no, that's definitely right. I guess I was talking more in the context of having 2 separate works that you're saying. Usually if someone's going to sue and say, or take action or raise an issue with, hey, that top line melody sounds like the top line melody of my song that existed before that song was written, you find that it's pretty rare that artists will take issue unless it's really flagrant.
So I guess we've laid out all the mines in the minefield, and there's lots of them. And we've only touched on them. Phil, you're in that minefield every day as a producer. How do you negotiate? I mean, how well do you know the law, or do you just sort of go by what feels right, or do you just do what you need to do?
Well, we talked about the difference between the written music and the written word, but there's also the totally separate sphere of the recording itself. And that's where most people who sample get into trouble, because they might just take a note, or even just a single word or something like that, and think, well, it's less than 2 seconds, or it's not consequential to the work or something, without considering that a copyright exists in the actual recording, and that more often than not that's owned by a corporation. or a large company, and they're the people that will go after you for that. And that's the kind of, minefield that I'm in. I'm not really stealing melodies or stealing people's songs, which, is kind of why with the Gautier example, I'll be just like, hey man, just play it. It's just a riff, don't worry about it. But if he was actually sampling the Louis Bonfa track, that's a completely different situation, because a copyright is owned in the recording itself. And that's where you can really get into trouble. Like, I remember Regurgitator sampled a tiny bit of Silver Convention. They just sampled the words "That's Right" in a song that winded up being a hit, and I think they had to shell out quite a bit of money. Whereas you might think when doing something that it's just incidental, and also a label I was once on, an English label called Tummy Touch. An artist on that label called Organic Audio did his entire album with instruments and synthesizers and drum machines and whatnot. And when the label was about to release the album and said, "Now, are there any samples we need to clear?" He said, "No, there's no samples we need to clear at all." And he'd forgot that he'd sampled the word "come on" out of a Bohannon track. Bohannon himself went to the movies in New York City, and the song was licensed to, there was sync rights done, it was in the closing credits. And so he heard the "come on" from his song, sat there, wrote down the name, went home, called his lawyer, and it ended up costing them tens of thousands of pounds for one single word, which would be the easiest thing to overlook. And that's really the perils of sampling from a hip hop perspective, I guess, or just from a bedroom producer perspective. Those are the kind of copyright issues that come up time and time again.
From a creative perspective, how constraining is that for you? I know we talked the other day about the second Avalanches album. It's been 12 years in the making, and so many samples that have, and it's still coming. I mean, have you had situations like that yourself, where you've had a great thing, you've had to throw it out, or you haven't been kind of game enough to run the gauntlet?
Yeah, we've had songs where they couldn't clear the sample, so the song hasn't been released, and it's as simple as that. And that's really common in the music world. And then you get into another grey area with reproducing samples. If you've already put in an application saying my song is based on your song, and then for whatever reason the terms aren't agreed, and you go away and replay the sample, that's a whole nother kettle of fish, where you could be getting sued again for ripping off their song, which was, I guess, more what we were talking about before.
A lot of people have to make the commercial decision, and you find that sort of what we're talking about is that when something's a hit and everyone's hearing it and there's money at stake, you'll find that people are much more, put things under a lot more scrutiny. But a lot of artists that I represent, they'll come and say, well, these are the samples we've got on our record, like what's it going to cost to clear it? And you'll say, well, this is probably what they're going to charge, this is probably a ballpark amount. And ultimately it's up to them to make the commercial decision and either say, I'm going to run the gauntlet and not clear it, which lots of people do. Lots of people got records that got samples all over them that they've never cleared.
Which ones?
We all know.
Definitely can't say that. But they're kind of, that's the decision they make. They can either say, well, either I can not release it at all, I can release it and hope that no one finds it, I can release it and if someone finds it, I can, declare myself bankrupt and forget about it, or I can spend a whole lot of money and clear in advance. I might never sell a record, no one might ever hear it, maybe this is a futile exercise. Like I've got one client that's a big kind of indie electronic act that unknowingly sampled a Ciron sample, and the estate came after us, or came after my client, and in the end it's still unresolved because they worked out that the track had made 10 grand and it was like a very small sample. In the end I think nothing's probably going to happen with it. Like we've made an offer of compromise.
What do you mean by unknowingly sampled?
Like lots of people do who make electronic music, just had their own sample bank of just thousands of samples they'd made of various things, or picked up from royalty-free licenses where you're allowed to use those samples, and hadn't consciously gone, I've heard this song, I'm going to steal that. And it was like a percussion loop. But it was clearly from a pretty famous disco song, and they, for whatever reason, it kind of hadn't cleared it, hadn't thought about it. But it's probably nothing's going to happen with it because the song over its entire life has earned 10 grand. It may be that we end up paying them $1,000 or paying them something to settle it, but they're never going to sue in this jurisdiction because it'll cost them
more than that.
Yeah, it'll cost them many times
expensive,
that.
Aren't you?
It's really expensive. Like if you want to bring an action in Australian jurisdiction at the federal court, it's like it has to be a lot of money at stake to justify doing it.
Can we? I mean, I guess it's probably also worth talking about the fact that that's the kind of more negative size. But there are actually tens of thousands of tracks that are paid out on regularly that have heaps and heaps of samples in them. It is possible to clear samples relatively cheaply if, you know, it's not all bad news. And I think that's important discussion to have as well, because a lot of people will be able to buy out or, you know.
And the thing is that
go through
copyright is like property. So you still have the choice as the owner of the copyright to do what you want to do. Like if it's a song that I've written and recorded, I can say no and say you can't use it, I don't want anyone else to use it. Or I can say yes, I'd love you to use it, that'd be amazing. And lots of artists have broken because people have used their samples with great success. So most artists are pretty enthusiastic about it.
There's also the question of the statute of limitations. I think there was a case that you've got an example of, Phil, that it was
yes.
quite a while after the song was released, the original copyright owners kind of went, hang on a minute.
Yeah, it's about 25, 30 years later. And yeah, when you hear the song,
This speech is my recital. I think it's very vital to rock around. That's right. On time. It's tricky. It's the place. Here we go. It's tricky to rock around. To rock around. That's right. On time. It's tricky. It's tricky.
anybody familiar with the song My Sharona will realise that that's the riff that's being scratched in underneath, if you're not. Basically, he just slowed it down on the turntable and cut the record directly in. And the NAC, who do My Sharona, sued Run DMC, I think about a year ago or 2 years ago, and claimed that they'd never heard It's Tricky since it was released in 1987 or something like that.
They were dead.
Yeah, no, they honestly claimed they'd never heard the song.
How did they go?
The case is still going, I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure. It hasn't been decided.
Julian, you're not involved in this case, are you?
I'm not involved in this one. No, but the statute of limitations is it just basically means you can't claim damages back more than 6 years for civil claims. So the same thing happened in Men at Work case. So that even though Land Down Under was obviously a phenomenal hit in the 80s and a worldwide #1, the actual amount that they were fighting over was a lot less because it was really they were only able to trace back the damages for up to 6 years. So its massive earning power had already kind of been pretty heavily diminished.
There probably is a lot of bedroom producers here as well, and there's a lot of sample banks out there. And I know I use GarageBand a lot, and I have released, not for sale, but I've had stuff played on the radio that have GarageBand samples in it. Not big ones, just like percussion and the kick drum and stuff. As I established earlier, I'm too pretty for prison. How am I going to go in this case? Can you do that? And have there been cases of people getting in trouble for using the pre-programmed drums from things like that?
Did you register at 100% with us? You don't have to answer that question. Don't.
My attorney advises me to. No.
You can, generally speaking, if you're using sample libraries, most of them, or a lot of them will be royalty free. So the owner of the recording has part of the terms of you buying the sample library or of Apple putting them through GarageBand or whatever is agreeing that they're available and they're not going to claim copyright on it. So I guess the answer is it depends. If you're sampling a kick drum off a record, like an individual kick drum, unless it's, I can't really think of an example, maybe a New Order Blue Monday, but even, it's not really, it's got to be substantive reproduction. So it's got to be enough of a song that, there's no per second limit or whatever, but it does have to be identifiable and it does have to comprise enough of the song to be meaningful. So sampling an individual kick or hit, but then as you're talking about even a couple of words, if it's distinctive, like if people can acknowledge that it comes from that work, well, you are potentially going to get yourself in trouble. So short answer is if it's individual instrumental sounds, it's going to be pretty hard for someone to hear that and go, that's the kick drum off that record, you know, you're infringing on a copyright. But if they are able to do that, then you may well be considered to be substantially reproducing that copyright and therefore liable for infringement.
Especially in advertising, people use production music or library music as well. So not quite the same case, but you can get pre-cleared music in certain cases where people want to use it for, particularly people use it in, backing in film and TV work, or you work in advertising, you've probably got libraries of music that you know that you can use. You have to pay just a standard standard rate for it, but it's pre-cleared, so you don't actually have to worry about that side of it.
Yep.
And there are people out there who, that's how they get their livelihood. They create sounds that can be used in things like, commercial uses.
Is that something? Do you do that, Phil? Do you look for sort of library music? I know there's
It's not just music.
No. I mean, there's a whole bunch of 70s Brazilian library music that's, this whole kind of a fetish movement about that kind of music almost. Do you kind of actively look for stuff that you can use?
Well, yeah, all the time, but I'm more in the sampling from library records is done, but it's more on a flying under the radar thing where that only a very small amount of these were ever produced and probably they're out of circulation. I'm more of the single hit drum sound sampling kind of side of things, where there are qualities that are in the old recordings that are very hard to reproduce. Room sounds, old technology, and the way the mics were set up, all kinds of things. They're the kind of things that I'm more sampling.
Is that a calculated risk where you just choose to go?
Yeah, look, I'm not worried about it, about people discovering that I got, one hi-hat from some obscure record and left the reverb tail on it. It's not something that I'm concerned about. But a single grunts from James Brown is a different story.
Or the Jaws theme. Dunno.
Yeah, exactly. So if no one can tell what it is, then I think it's pretty difficult to be sued.
Well, we've been talking, I guess, around technology. Is technology moving too fast for the law in this case?
Not really. Like, people often ask me, are you keeping up with it? The law hasn't really changed, and I guess the only thing that, the technology hasn't really changed that much, except that it's probably easier to infringe on people's copyrights. Like, it's easier to share music and share files, and in terms of a music industry context, it's easy to download. But from a creative context, in terms of the music you make, other than having music production software more easily available and so on, I don't know that it's really changed it that much. I don't know if
is it more the quantity though, that you can quite easily download pretty much anything you want, and it's with any PC or laptop that you buy, there's going to be some sort of sampling software involved with it, whereas 30 years ago, it was pretty hard to come by a sampler, pretty hard to come by a whole crate of records.
I guess that's right. And like in older school hip hop world, there was like a secret community of people who pass around breaks in records, in pop records and whatever, that were just drum breaks, and they'd, do things with them and make tracks out of them. Whereas now you can go onto, it's very easy to find online communities who have just indexed pretty much every drum break from the beginning of recorded music to now, and you can get it all, and therefore it's easy to build tracks around. But that's just, I guess, that maybe more people are doing it, but I don't think the technology itself has changed the nature of the way people create that much, other than making stuff more accessible, maybe.
Well, should we hear from some of the people that have this evil technology at their fingertips? Has anybody got any questions? We've got a roving mic if anyone wants to throw a hand up. Is anybody throwing any tweets this way? We've got a question at the front here.
I just wondered about the process of negotiating the clearance of a sample, and what sort of agreements you'd be likely to come to about payments and things like that.
Yeah. Well, anything that you do in copyright has to be in writing, because under the terms of the Copyright Act, you can only make licences or assignments of copyright by a written instrument. So that's kind of the first thing that formally you've got to do. It depends. So it really depends on what it is you're clearing. So obviously if you're sampling the chorus of a song, which is a massive hook, as opposed to sampling a percussion loop, the person who's owns the chorus of a song is probably going to be a lot more demanding than the person who owns the percussion loop. I guess sometimes you're going to be clearing a master and a song. Sometimes you might be re-singing or replaying or retracking the sample that you're using, and therefore you don't have to clear the recording because you're not using the recording, but you're still using maybe the vocal hook or whatever it is. It also depends on the relative bargaining power of the two parties. So if I want to sample a Queen track, Queen are going to say, well, our relative bargaining power is if you put this track out, people are going to be buying it or being invested in it because of our relative notoriety and our huge fan base and all the records we've sold. No one knows who you are. Therefore, we want to own either the whole track or the majority of the track. Like, we were going to expect a pretty large share of the new copyright that you're purporting to create. And maybe if you want us to do this, you've got to pay us $20,000 up front for each copyright, or it really depends on who's publishing it and who it is. So, but on the flip side, if it's someone like Kanye West comes and says, hey, I want to use your song for my new work, I'm going to give you 5% of my new song. You can say, well, you know what? I'm not really earning nothing right now, and if you're going to sell 1 million copies of this and make me a star and maybe kickstart my career, well, amazing. Like, I'm not going to say no. Like, I'm going to push for as much as I can get, but in the end, I'm going to get the deal done because I'm not going to say you can't use it. So there's no set in stone answer. It's a commercial negotiation. It really depends on what is he using, what the new work's like, whether the person likes the new work. If someone falls in love with your work and thinks that what you've done is a beautiful homage to what they've done, you know, they may grant you the license on really nice terms. If they're really cantankerous and hate people using their work, so it might not matter what you offer them, they might still say no. So I guess, yeah, there's no real easy answer to that.
Kirsty, do people approach you at APRA about that kind of stuff very often?
Not in the sense. What they do if they're approaching us would be asking, that would be saying that their works are used, and they would request it would be put in suspense. So as long as it's not vexatious, and there's a couple of, you know, out there, people who've, you know, written great, you know, repertoires in, you know, strange places. We would put it, as long as we get it in writing, we'd actually just suspend any payments. So for us, it's very much, APRA's very much on we're on the remuneration, the business side. So if there's a dispute about the ownership of a song, we wouldn't be paying the owners until that's resolved. So it's in everyone's best interest, especially with a well-known track, that you'd probably clear it up pretty much straight away, or go into some sort of process. I mean, we've got a number of processes that people can go to. If it's on one level, we've got some dispute resolution opportunities, but in most cases it has to go back to the lawyers to negotiate, because especially if it's a sample, it's not something we can resolve. It has to be resolved by the copyright owners. They have their legal teams. They'll talk about it.
Do you always have to have a lawyer? Or can you go artist to artist and do it that way?
Depends what level you're working at.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah. I think it's... the only thing I'd say is that you want to make sure you're making an informed choice on either side of the transaction.
Yeah.
So you know that, I guess the advantage of having someone advise you is that you hopefully have someone that has done it before or can give you a bit of perspective to make an informed choice. But yeah, ultimately it comes down to you whether you want to license the sample or not.
Any other questions out here? We had one down here.
Sure. I'm just wondering if any of you guys know whether or not acts like Girl Talk clear their samples, which I don't think they do. And in that case, how do they then release records commercially available at JB?
Oh, we're in the grey area.
He doesn't clear them, and who the hell knows how. It's just that no one's ever chosen to sue him. Like,
But he doesn't get paid on them either, I don't think.
I think he's got enough goodwill that, and I don't know.
We talked about this before, and we didn't have an answer.
There's no question that clearly he's copyright infringing in every track multiple times. And I was actually asking the question because I didn't actually know that whether he was actually selling his records or whether he was making them available, but obviously he is.
He is. I actually sell them at JB.
Yeah, right.
And,
The label's called Illegal Art. So this is a label that's been around for a long time, if you can't hear on the other side. It's been around for 30 years or so, and yeah. So it is just...
Yeah, I mean, I guess people are
that
making a
grey
commercial
area.
decision. I was kind of floating the idea before, or suggesting that, I guess, I'm assuming that because there's so many copyright infringements on any one track and any one record, maybe people take the commercial view and go, well, how much is really at stake? How many records is he actually selling? You know, if we go home for Beyonce, that means it's going to trigger everyone else to file suit as well, and we're all going to end up having 1,000 different copyright owners all squabbling over, you know, X number of dollars, which...
Good for the lawyers.
The dollars themselves might sound impressive, but when you're splitting up between so many people and then paying for lawyers and lawsuits, maybe they just say, well, A, maybe it isn't that commercial, and B, you know, maybe Beyonce says, you know what, I actually like him, I don't want you to sue him. Like, that may be as simple as that.
It goes back to choice, I guess. So, somewhere someone's made choices about not taking that line. they have the opportunity to, if they own the copyright and they're the and they have that intellectual property. If they haven't, that choice has been retained by that person who controls the copyright. Who knows why?
That brings up a really interesting point, though, the Girl Talk example, and I guess, Phil, you're talking about the reality of people infringing all the time. Is there a tipping point? Is there some point where copyright is just not going to matter anymore because enough people are ignoring it and that there's not enough resources to chase all those cases down?
I mean, I don't understand what's going on with Girl Talk at all, because there are various artists, DJ Shadow, for example, who may receive more than a dozen infringement notices per album, and he's not. I mean, he's not Rolling Stones big. He's a well-known artist, but I'd say Girl Talk and Shadow are comparative in terms of they play festivals, they sell records, but they're not like in the actual pop charts. The Girl Talk thing is just, I have no idea how he doesn't get sued. I just don't understand it at all. It's like if there was any reason that I could put behind it, I'd call it a double standard, but I don't have any reason to call it a double standard. But nobody in hip hop seems to get away with it like he does. He just gets away with it, and nobody knows why.
Reserving the fact that we actually don't know. I mean, there may be a million lawsuits that haven't been come through. I mean,
It's true, and it may be that if this record label's putting out through a company that only does his releases and doesn't. It may be they give away all the income from it to companies. It may well be they don't earn a dollar. I mean, for Girl Talk, that's a loss leader for his live show anyway. Like his business is built around playing festivals.
Business is live, yeah.
Couldn't in the US some of them refer to it as parody and then get away with it with First Amendment?
I don't know. No, is the short answer.
No.
It's got to be like Australian equivalent is satire. There is judicial tests around what that means, and it has to be more than just
that's weird.
fun.
So it doesn't have to be funny then. Sorry. Did you have another question? No? Is there any other questions here?
Hi, I was just wondering about cover versions, and if an artist re-records a song entirely and that song becomes a hit, do they need to clear that beforehand? Do they get any sort of remuneration for that new recording of the track, or how does that work?
Yeah, there's a bunch of so when you do a re-record of a song that already exists, you obviously create a new copyright because you're creating the recording. So your band or your act or your version of that song, but the composition or the song itself already exists. So every time a record's sold or a record is licensed for film and TV or a sample license is granted for something there's revenue earned on both sides of the copyright because there's two copyrights being exploited. So when you sell a record, you're going to earn the money that gets paid to someone at JB Hi-Fi. Retailer takes their cut. Record company gets the remainder. Some of it, and it's not a huge amount, but some of it they're paying the owners of the songs, and that's commonly recorded mechanical royalty. So if you've written a song and someone does a cover of it, if the Strokes do a cover and go and sell 1 million records with it, you're going to be earning a pretty nice royalty as the songwriter. There's I guess 4 main things that you control as the owner of a song, and one of them is the right to make a copy. And the right that you're accessing is called the mechanical royalty, is granted to you by statute. So once a song's been commercially released the first time, any of us could go out and make a cover version of it and release it on records to the public. There's lots of things we still can't do with it, though, without the permission of the copyright owner, or only the copyright owner can do. So if Disney want to use it for their new blockbuster film, they might come and say, we love your recorded version of that song, we want to license it from you. You can say, well, yes, I own the recording, I can license you that, but I don't own the song, and I can't grant you that license. You've got to go and talk to Lennon McCartney or people that own the Beatles catalogue, and they'll license you the song, I can license you the recording. So I guess the short answer is yes, you can do it, and you don't need permission up front to commercially release a recording because there's a statutory license you can access, and as long as you pay the mechanical royalties, or your record company does, that's fine. But there's also lots of things you still can't do without the copyright owner saying yes.
I was just wondering the best way I can explain this is through an example. Laid Back Luke remixed the song from Winter Garden, Dirty Talk, and then Ian Carey took it, that remix, that had been remixed and then performed it all the way around the world on the tour, in a tour. Obviously, he produced a CD, so I imagine he had to get clearance at some point. But if you just wanted to play that as a DJ in a club, would you have to pay royalties to anyone?
It's actually an APRA question. Because what we're actually talking about is the public performance, because one of the rights given to the people who own the song is the right to public performance, which is actually what we license. So if a place like the Toff would have a license for the public performance of music, which is this, or someone playing live here. If a DJ is playing that work in a club, that club probably has a license from the society that is able to license it. In Australia, that's APRA, but we have a network of collecting societies around the world that would do the same thing as what we did here. If it was here, if it was at Revolver would have an APRA licence. They do have an APRA licence, and we would, well, this is actually quite an interesting thing because we're in the process of changing this, but we would actually pay the person who wrote the song in the first place from the information we get from hopefully the DJs, but as we're moving into the future, we're using music recognition technology to know who to pay, which is something we're talking with Phil about at the moment. So,
how does that practically work for you, Phil?
Well, for the DJs, it means is if you fill out your APRA forms and you lodge, like a certain, people say pay $10 to get in, you know, a couple of bucks of that goes to pay into these pools of money that are then paid out to the artists, and the more accurate the DJs report what music that they play, the more accurately the pool of money is divided amongst the copyright holders. So as far as if, you know, DJ X does a remix of song Y, the remix itself might not be recognised, but the original songwriters will get their share.
yeah, unless the remix person had a share of the copyright, that's the only way they'd get paid.
But there's also, for recorded music, so for dance music, for DJs that are playing as opposed to live bands, there's an APRA public performance licence which represents the songwriter, and there's an organisation called the PPCA which represent the owners of the recordings. So in dance world, the PPCA licence for nightclubs is actually a pretty hefty licence because they put a high value on it because people are going to these places purely to hear recorded music. So if you're I guess the question is who gets paid off that remix. It depends who owns the recording and who's the registered songwriter. But if you are Tiesto, when you do a remix of someone, unless they're someone who's of an equal scale, you say, hey, I'm Tiesto, I'm massive Dutch DJ or whatever it is, I'm owning the remix. If you're meant to do the remix, I'm going to own it. I'm going to be the guy who collects all these different income streams.
And that power of the remix, the jobbing remixer, there's a lot of songs on our repertoire which the remixers do claim they have been able to negotiate with the original copyright owner because they know getting someone huge to remix their work means there's a whole new life to their work, so they're willing to make that. They'll negotiate that deal because it's worth it for them. So if they get played everywhere where they weren't getting played before because someone's remixed it, they've made a commercial decision that they're okay with that and they'll give them a share of the copyright.
And on the flip side, like you see particularly in blog world, like if a band like a Phoenix or a Friendly Fires or someone puts a single out, they'll often make the stems pretty much available to absolutely anyone to do remixes, but the deal is you don't get a cut of anything. Like you can do the remix, but you're doing it to put on blogs and to build your own profile, and you might be a single person in a bedroom going, hey, I'm going to try and build a bit of a fan base by my Phoenix remix, but you're doing it purely for, you're never going to get a return on it. So the other end of the bargaining power scale where you've got no bargaining power, but you're saying, well, I'm actually trading off this bigger act's bargaining power and I'm going to waive royalties on it.
Which is actually, the Hilltop Hoods did here recently, this year, because they put a whole lot of music up on a website as part of a competition and you could remix it, do whatever you liked with it. They were okay with that as long as you didn't claim that you owned it. And there was actually a whole competition built around you remixing their work, and the person who won that competition, you know, they faded them and they took them around and they're involved with those guys at the moment. So, you know, people do use it in different ways.
Well, that might be all we have time for. Hopefully we've covered enough territory to get you at least some of the way through that minefield. I'd really like to thank our speakers this evening, Julian Hewitt, Kirsty Rivers from APRA, and DJ Phil Ransom. Thanks very much, guys.